The church was silent, save for the soft rustle of tissues and muffled sobs. Mourners in tailored suits and elegant dresses surrounded the gleaming casket of Franklin Hayes, the town's beloved philanthropist. But when an elderly black woman, Clara Reynolds, stepped forward, the room stiffened. "My name is Clara Reynolds," she began, her voice calm yet piercing. "You're mourning a man you never truly knew." What truth could she reveal that would shatter everything they believed? Before we dive in, where are you watching from? If you believe in standing for justice, hit like and subscribe for more stories like this. Clara Reynolds stood firm, her gaze unwavering as murmurs rippled through the crowd. The polished image of Franklin Hayes, the town's celebrated benefactor, was beginning to crack under the weight of her words, and she wasn't finished. 50 years ago, Clara continued, her voice steady despite the emotions simmering beneath. Franklin Hayes wasn't the man you all admired. He was something else entirely. And I was there when it all began. The room blurred around her as memories swept her back to the sweltering heat of 1968, deep in the heart of Selma, Alabama. Clara, barely 20, had just finished handing out flyers for a voter registration drive when she first saw him. A tall, clean-cut white boy stood awkwardly by the church steps, watching the gathering of mostly black activists. His crisp button-up shirt clung to his back, sweat betraying his nerves. At first, Clara thought he was another reporter looking for a sensational headline or, worse, a hostile observer ready to report their activities to the local authorities. But when Franklin rolled up his sleeves and grabbed a stack of pamphlets from an older organizer, her curiosity deepened. "Excuse me," she had called out, walking up to him. "You lost, mister?" Franklin had blinked, startled, then flashed an uncertain smile. "No, ma'am, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." He introduced himself, Franklin Hayes, a junior at Montgomery State College, volunteering with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. His accent had the soft drawl of Southern privilege, the kind that usually came with disdain for people like Clara. But there was no arrogance in his tone, only determination. Skeptical but intrigued, Clara handed him more flyers. "If you're really here to help, we'll see how long you last." Franklin lasted longer than anyone expected. He marched beside them, registered voters, and even took part in late-night strategy meetings. But his presence didn't go unnoticed by the white community. Whispers spread like wildfire. Franklin Hayes, the Hayes boy, running around with those civil rights folks? It wasn't just scandalous, it was dangerous. Clara still remembered the first time they faced real retaliation together. It was after a peaceful sit-in at a whites-only diner. As they exited the building, triumphant despite being forcibly removed, a group of young white men waited for them on the sidewalk. Clara's heart had pounded, but Franklin stepped in front of her without hesitation. "You really think you belong here, boy?" one of the men sneered, his eyes flicking to Clara with thinly veiled hatred. "Messing around with trash like this?" Franklin's jaw tightened, but his voice was calm. "You don't scare me." That was the moment Clara saw it, the fire. In his eyes, the defiance of someone who had tasted privilege but chose to stand against it. They escaped unscathed that day, but the damage had already been done. Within a week, Franklin's world began to unravel. His father, Thomas Hayes, a prominent businessman with deep ties to the local Chamber of Commerce, received an anonymous tip about his son's activities. It didn't take long for Franklin to face the consequences. His scholarship, a generous endowment funded by a network of conservative donors, was revoked under the guise of academic misconduct. His professors, once supportive, suddenly found fault in his work. Even his landlord served an eviction notice without explanation. When Franklin showed up at the church basement that evening, Clara barely recognized him. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie missing, and the confident gleam in his eyes had dulled. "They cut me off," he muttered, sinking into a folding chair. "No money, no home, just like that." Clara sat beside him, hands clasped in her lap. She had seen it before, white allies who faced the barest taste of oppression and fled, retreating to the comfort of their skin color. But Franklin didn't speak of leaving. Instead, he looked at her, his face set with quiet resolve. "I'm not going back," he said. "My family, my school, they can have it all, but I'm not turning my back on this." Clara believed him. She shouldn't have. But she did. And for a time, Franklin proved her right. He moved into a small apartment in the black side of town, took odd jobs and continued his activism. Together, they organized sit-ins, taught literacy classes, and fought voter suppression. He was more than an ally. He was a brother in arms. But the world had a way of grinding down even the strongest spirits. The more Franklin pushed, the more resistance he faced, not just from strangers, but from his own blood. His mother, a delicate woman with sharp blue eyes, had visited Clara, once unannounced and uninvited. Please, she had pleaded, her manicured hands trembling as she clutched her pearl necklace. He's throwing his life away for this. Talk some sense into him. Clara had stood tall, refusing to be cowed. Your son's finally standing for something real. I won't be the one to make him stop. The older woman had left with a cold glare and a parting shot that lingered long after she was gone. If he keeps choosing your people over his own, he'll end up with nothing. That prediction came true faster than anyone expected. The final blow landed when Franklin was arrested during a peaceful protest outside the county courthouse. The arrest itself wasn't unusual, but the aftermath was brutal. He was beaten in custody, ribs cracked, face bruised almost beyond recognition. Clara had bailed him out herself, using money meant for rent, as she helped him limp back to his apartment. She couldn't hold back anymore. How long can you keep this up, Franklin? They're breaking you piece by piece. He had smiled then, a sad, tired smile. As long as it takes. But not even Franklin Hayes could fight forever. The night that changed everything came shortly after. A local newspaper published a front-page exposé branding him a race traitor and accusing him of inciting violence. The article wasn't just inflammatory, it was a death sentence. His apartment was vandalized, tires slashed, windows shattered. The threats became daily occurrences, and then he vanished. For weeks, Clara searched, fearing the worst. It wasn't, until she received a crumpled envelope slipped under her door that she understood. Inside was a one-way bus ticket to Riverton, a small town 2 states away, and a single note in Franklin's familiar scrawl. I can't fight this fight anymore. I'm sorry. Clara had stared at the paper, disbelief and betrayal twisting in her chest. Franklin Hayes, the man who stood tall against the world, had run. Now, standing beside his casket, Clara's gaze swept across the mourners, their polished appearances and rehearsed grief. None of them knew the young man who once defied everything for justice. They only knew the version he became, the respectable businessman, the philanthropist who never spoke of his past. You celebrate his charity, Clara said, her voice steady but sharp. But do you know what it cost? Do you know who he had to betray to become the man you admired? Silence hung heavy in the air. In the back row, a woman in pearls exchanged an uneasy glance with her husband. The mayor, who had just praised Franklin's unwavering integrity, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Clara stepped closer to the casket, her hand tightening around the white lily she held. 50 years ago, Franklin Hayes chose justice over comfort, but somewhere along the way he made a different choice, and that choice destroyed lives. She placed the flower atop the casket and turned to face the stunned crowd. The question is, are you brave enough to hear the rest? The church remained silent, the weight of Clara's words pressing down like a leaden blanket. The image of Franklin Hayes, the beloved philanthropist, the man whose name adorned libraries and community centers, had begun to fracture. The man they thought they knew was little more than a mask, hiding sacrifices and betrayals no one had dared to speak of. But Clara wasn't finished. You think Franklin was always the man you admired? No. That man was built on the ashes of someone he left behind. The memory was as sharp as broken glass. After Franklin disappeared from Selma, Clara didn't hear from him for nearly 2 years. Life moved on, though not kindly. She found work as a housekeeper in Birmingham, scrubbing, floors in homes that never welcomed her gaze. Every time she passed a television or picked up a newspaper, she wondered if Franklin had truly escaped, or if she'd one day find his name in an obituary, another casualty of a fight he could no longer endure. Then, in the summer of 1971, she saw his face again, smiling from the society pages of a local newspaper. Franklin Hayes joins Riverton Real Estate Consortium, the headline read. There he was, arm around a blonde woman in a pastel dress, standing proudly beside a group of white businessmen. The caption beneath the photo made Clara's stomach twist. A shining example of unity and progress. Progress. The word soured in her mouth. Clara had boarded a bus the next morning, spending what little savings she had to get to Riverton. She told herself it was curiosity, maybe closure, but deep down, she needed to see it with her own eyes, to know if Franklin had truly abandoned everything they'd fought for. Finding him wasn't hard. Riverton was a small town, and Franklin had already made himself known. He had invested in local housing developments, partnered with Howard Klein, a real estate magnate notorious for urban renewal projects that displaced black families, under the guise of progress. Clara didn't want to believe it, but the proof was there, etched into every freshly painted storefront and every demolished home. She confronted him outside his new office, a sleek building that stood in stark contrast to the crumbling neighborhoods nearby. Franklin froze when he saw her, the color draining from his face. "Clara?" His voice was soft, almost disbelieving. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," she snapped, stepping closer. "Is this what you left for? To build your fortune on the backs of the people you once fought for?" Franklin's eyes darted around, nervous. People were watching. White people. The kind who wouldn't take kindly to a black woman berating one of their own. He gently grabbed her arm, steering her toward the side alley. "It's not what you think," he insisted, voice low. "I didn't have a choice." Clara yanked her arm free. "There's always a choice. You chose comfort. You chose silence." Franklin sighed, running a hand through his hair. He looked older, wearier, the idealism of his youth ground down by years of survival. "I was drowning, Clara. After Selma, after losing everything, I had nowhere to go. Howard offered me a way out, a chance to rebuild." "At what cost?" she demanded. "How many families did you push out of their homes for that fancy office? How many lives did you trade for your peace?" Franklin didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence spoke volumes. Clara stepped back, shaking her head. "You were supposed to be different. We trusted you. I trusted you." For a moment, Franklin looked like he might break, like the weight of his choices was finally too much to bear. But then his expression hardened, and the man Clara had known, the man who once stood between her and a mob of angry white men, was gone. "This world doesn't reward righteousness," he said quietly. "It punishes it. I did what I had to do to survive." Clara's heart broke, not just for herself, but for the man Franklin could have been. Without another word, she turned and walked away, vowing never to look back. But fate had other plans. 2 years later, when Clara's sister fell ill and the hospital refused to admit her without upfront payment, Clara swallowed her pride and called Franklin. He answered on the first ring, his voice warm but guarded. "Clara," he said, almost relieved. "It's been a while." "I need help," she admitted, the words bitter on her tongue. "They won't treat Ruby unless I can pay. I don't have that kind of money." There was a pause, then the soft clatter of papers as Franklin shuffled through something. "I'll wire the money today," he promised. But this is the last time, Clara. I can't keep risking my position. Risking his position. As if helping the very people he once fought for was a liability, not a duty. True to his word, the money arrived within hours. Ruby received treatment, but the damage was done. Clara couldn't forget the coldness in Franklin's voice, the way he spoke like a man shackled by his own success. "And that," Clara said, voice trembling as she stood beside Franklin's casket, "was the moment I realized Franklin Hayes had died long before his heart stopped beating. He didn't just betray me, he betrayed himself." The mourners shifted. Uneasily, their carefully crafted image of Franklin unraveling thread by thread. A man in the front row, Councilman Reed, one of Franklin's closest associates, cleared his throat, face flushed with anger. This is slander," he sputtered. "Franklin Hayes was a pillar of this community. He gave more to this town than any of us." Clara met his gaze, unflinching. Did he? Or did he buy your silence while he turned his back on the people who needed him most? The councilman fell silent. Clara stepped back from the casket, the weight of years of betrayal settling heavy on her shoulders. She had exposed the truth, but at what cost? Would the town remember Franklin as the hero they wanted him to be, or would they finally see the man he had become? Comment number 1 if you believe Franklin betrayed his own values, like if you think survival justified his choices. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. But the real question remains. What happens when the truth you fought so hard to bury finally comes to light? Stay tuned because Clara's story is far from over. The weight of Clara's words hung in the air, suffocating the room like an unwelcome truth no one wanted to confront. Franklin Hayes, the man they celebrated with floral arrangements and polished speeches, was no longer the untouchable icon the town had revered. But Clara knew the story wasn't complete. Not yet. She stepped closer to the casket, eyes narrowing as if addressing Franklin himself. You all see the man in the tailored suit, the generous donor, the respectable businessman. But what you don't see, the part Franklin made sure no one ever saw, were the sacrifices he buried deep enough to choke on. The crowd leaned in, curiosity and discomfort etched into their faces. Franklin's eldest son, Michael Hayes, shifted uneasily in the front row, arms crossed, jaw clenched. He had always idolized his father, inheriting not just Franklin's sharp features but also his stubborn pride. Clara didn't flinch under his glare. It wasn't just my sister's hospital bill, Clara continued, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Franklin tried to make up for the lives he trampled on, but only in the shadows, because doing it out in the open, that would have cost him everything he'd built. She inhaled deeply, the memory sharp as ever. It was 1974, 2 years after Franklin had wired the money for Ruby's treatment. Clara hadn't spoken to him since, pride and bitterness keeping her distance, but fate had other plans. Late one evening, just as the sun dipped behind the rusted rooftops of Riverton's Black Quarter, a knock echoed through Clara's tiny apartment. Warily she peeked through the cracked blinds. Franklin stood there, older, wearier, his crisp suit rumpled as if he'd been wrestling with indecision all day. "Clara," he said quietly when she opened the door, "I need your help." Her first instinct was to slam the door in his face, but something in his expression, desperation laced with shame, gave her pause. Against her better judgment, she stepped aside. Franklin didn't sit. He stood near the window, staring out at the flickering street lamp, like a man watching his own past rise from the pavement. "Howard knows," he muttered finally, voice hoarse. "About the scholarships." Clara frowned. "What scholarships?" He turned to her, shoulders sagging. "The ones I've been funding under your name, for the kids displaced by the Riverton projects. I thought if I did it quietly, it'd balance the scales." Shock washed over her. Clara had known about the scholarships, of course. Every family in the neighborhood whispered about the anonymous benefactor who kept bright young students from falling through the cracks. But never in her wildest dreams had she imagined Franklin was behind it. "Why under my name?" she asked, suspicion sharpening her tone. Franklin sighed, rubbing his temples. "Because if my business partners found out, if the people I'd aligned myself with knew I was funneling money back into the very communities they were trying to erase, everything I built would have crumbled. My reputation, my investments, my family's safety." Clara's heart hardened. "So you bought your peace with dirty money and used my name as a shield?" Franklin flinched but didn't deny it. "I never wanted to betray you or them, but the moment I chose survival over the fight, I lost the right to stand beside you. This was the only way I knew how to make amends." She stared at him, fury warring with reluctant understanding. Franklin Hayes, the man who once marched defiantly against injustice, had become a ghost, haunted by the very ideals he'd sacrificed for comfort. "And now Howard Klein knows," Clara said, folding her arms. "What does he want?" Franklin's eyes darkened. "For me to stop, cut the scholarships, cut ties with the community entirely. He thinks if I keep feeding the roots, the tree will grow back stronger." "And will you?" Clara challenged. Silence. Then, softly, "I don't know how much fight I have left, Clara." That admission cut deeper than any betrayal. This wasn't the Franklin she had marched beside, the man who once stood between her and a baton-wielding cop without hesitation. This was someone hollowed out by compromise too far, gone to remember what true courage felt like. Clara shook her head. "You don't get to straddle the line, Franklin. Either you stand for something or you fall for everything." Franklin left that night without an answer, but the fallout came swiftly. 2 weeks later, the scholarships vanished. Families who had relied on that quiet stream of support found their applications rejected without explanation. The tutoring centers Franklin quietly funded closed their doors, and the neighborhood, already struggling under the weight of systemic neglect, began to unravel once more. Clara confronted him again, this time in his pristine office overlooking Riverton's newly gentrified downtown. Franklin sat behind a mahogany desk, papers meticulously stacked, the very image of a man who had won the game by selling his soul. "Howard got to you," Clara accused, slamming a newspaper onto his desk. The headline screamed, "Community program funding mysteriously withdrawn, hundreds left without resources." Franklin didn't look up. It was either this or lose everything. "Everything," Clara snapped, "or everyone. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you already lost the only thing that ever mattered, your damn integrity." His hand trembled as he reached for a glass of bourbon. "You think integrity pays the bills, keeps the lights on, protects my family?" "No," Clara shot back, eyes blazing. "But it lets you sleep at night. Can you even do that anymore, Franklin? Sleep?" For the first time his mask cracked. Franklin Hayes, the man the town hailed as a savior, looked like nothing more than a frightened child playing dress-up in the clothes of success. "You don't understand," he whispered, voice raw. "Every step I took away from the movement, away from you, was another chain around my neck. I'm not free, Clara, I never was." But understanding didn't absolve him. Clara left without another word, the final thread of their once unbreakable bond severed. Now, standing in the church, Clara's gaze swept the room, landing on Howard. Klein himself, older but no less dangerous, seated near the back with a satisfied smirk curling his lips. He'd won, after all. Franklin had folded, and the community had paid the price. "But Franklin didn't just betray me," Clara continued, voice sharp enough to cut glass. "He betrayed every child who had a chance at college, every family pushed out of their home, every dream deferred because he chose comfort over courage." The crowd shifted, uncomfortable. Michael Hayes's face was stone, unreadable. Margaret Hayes, Franklin's widow, sat stiffly, clutching a lace handkerchief like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. And the worst part? Clara's voice dropped, almost a whisper now. He hated himself for it. Every donation, every plaque with his name on it was a monument to guilt. Franklin Hayes spent his life drowning in regret, too proud to ask for forgiveness, and too cowardly to change. The room, once filled with murmured condolences and rehearsed grief, now sat in stunned silence, because this wasn't the eulogy they expected. It was an autopsy, peeling back the skin of Franklin's legacy to expose the rot beneath. Clara stepped away from the casket, her throat tight. She had come to tell the truth, not for revenge, but for closure. But looking at the faces before her, some horrified, some furious, some quietly nodding in reluctant agreement, she wondered if the truth would ever be enough. Franklin had sacrificed everything for survival. But in the end, had he really survived at all? The church remained silent, save for the occasional rustle of fabric as mourners shifted in their seats, eyes darting toward one another in disbelief. Clara stood tall, unyielding beside Franklin's casket. She had exposed the man behind the polished reputation, but the truth was like a wound, raw, bleeding, and far from healing. "You think Franklin's story ends with betrayal?" Clara's voice cut through the hush. "It doesn't. Because while he built his success on silence, the rest of us, we paid the price." The crowd leaned in, unable to look away as Clara continued. After Franklin withdrew the scholarships, the cracks in Riverton's black community widened into chasms. "Clara, already struggling to make ends meet after her sister's passing, watched helplessly as families were uprooted, children pulled from schools, and small businesses boarded up their windows. The quiet lifeline Franklin had provided, however, tainted by guilt, had been severed. It didn't take long for the vultures to descend. Landlords, emboldened by new zoning regulations, doubled the rent in historically black neighborhoods. When tenants couldn't pay, eviction notices flooded the streets like confetti after a parade, except this parade celebrated displacement, not joy. Clara's own apartment, a modest two-bedroom she had called home for nearly 15 years, wasn't spared. She stood in the doorway as the landlord, Bert Henley, a man whose family had owned half the block since segregation, waved the eviction notice like a victory flag. "You had a good run, Miss Reynolds," Bert sneered, his cigarette dangling from his lips. "But progress waits for no one. This neighborhood's getting an upgrade. New shops, new faces, time for the old ones to move on." Clara's hands trembled, not from fear but from rage. "Progress," she spat. "You mean pushing us out? To make room for people who'll never know the history you're bulldozing?" Bert chuckled, taking a slow drag from his cigarette. "History don't pay the bills, sweetheart. Money does, and your kind ain't got enough of it." Clara slammed the door in his face, heart pounding. But shutting the door didn't stop the inevitable. 2 weeks later, she and her granddaughter Yasmin stood on the cracked sidewalk, suitcases at their feet, watching as movers hauled their lives into a rusted truck. Clara turned to the crowd in the church, eyes blazing. While Franklin smiled for charity galas and shook hands with politicians, we were losing everything. And when I reached out, when I begged him to use his influence to stop the destruction he once claimed to fight against, you know what he told me? Her gaze locked onto Michael Hayes, Franklin's son, whose face had gone pale. He said, "I can't risk my standing, Clara. You have to understand." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Understand what? That the man who once stood in front of police batons now hid behind boardroom doors. That survival meant turning his back on the very people who gave his life meaning? But the worst was yet to come. The eviction was just the beginning. 3 weeks after Clara and Yasmin moved into a rundown motel on the edge of town, Clara's son Marcus was pulled over by Riverton police while driving home from his night shift. His only crime? Driving. An older model car through a revitalized neighborhood, one Franklin's investments had helped gentrify. The officer, Deputy Grant, had a reputation. Everyone knew to avoid his patrol car, marked or not. But Marcus didn't have that choice. Clara's voice wavered, but she pressed on. "They said it was a routine stop, claimed his taillight was out. But we all know what it really was, as I call reminder, that no matter how hard we worked, how clean we lived, our skin made us suspects." Marcus was handcuffed on the spot, his protests ignored. The next morning, Clara found him bruised and bloodied in a holding cell, charged with resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. "I went to Franklin," Clara said, bitterness curling around each word. "Begged him to make a call, pull some strings, remind the mayor, the sheriff, someone, anyone, that Marcus wasn't a threat." Franklin had listened, face drawn and tired. But when Clara finished, he simply shook his head. "I can't interfere with law enforcement, Clara. It'll look bad." "Look bad?" Clara snapped. "To who? The people who already hate us, or the ones writing your checks?" Franklin didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence was enough. "Marcus spent 3 months in county jail," Clara said, voice rising. 3 months for nothing. Lost his job, lost his apartment, and when they finally dropped the charges, the damage was done. Heads bowed in shame or avoidance, but Clara didn't soften her gaze. That was Franklin's legacy. Not the scholarships, not the donation plaques, but silence, compliance, abandonment. And still, the hits kept coming. Her nephew James, a promising athlete with a scholarship to the state university, was next. He had come home for the holidays, celebrating with friends at a local diner. It should have been a night of laughter and joy. Instead, it ended in tragedy. A group of white men, drunk, emboldened by the unchecked racism festering beneath Riverton's polished exterior, took offense to James's presence. Words turned to shoves, shoves turned to fists. And when James tried to walk away, one of the men pulled a baseball bat from his truck. They left him in an alley, Clara whispered, voice thick with emotion. Paralyzed from the waist down. My strong, vibrant nephew, who once dreamed of running track at the Olympics, reduced to a wheelchair because this town never forgave us for existing. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. I called Franklin again, pleaded with him to speak out, to use his power to demand justice. He had sighed, rubbing his temples like her pain was an inconvenience. Clara, he'd said, voice strained, I can't fight every battle. I have a family to think about, a family. As if hers didn't count. Clara stepped away from the casket, scanning the room. Tell me, was Franklin's family more deserving of peace than mine? Did his comfort outweigh our survival? The crowd sat frozen, confronted not just with Franklin's failures but with their own complicity. They had praised his generosity while ignoring the cost. They had admired his resilience while turning a blind eye to the lives crushed beneath his success. Clara's gaze lingered on Howard Klein still, seated near the back, his smirk now replaced with a tight, calculating expression. He had been the architect of so much suffering, but Franklin had laid the foundation. So don't sit here, Clara finished, voice firm, and tell me Franklin Hayes was a hero. He was a man, flawed, frightened, and, in the end, too broken to stand for what was right. Comment number 1, if you believe Franklin's silence was betrayal, like if you think survival justified his choices, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. But here's the real question. When the people you trust turn their backs, how do you find the strength to fight alone? Stay tuned, because Clara's battle was far from over. The air in the church thickened with tension. Clara's words had peeled away the polished veneer surrounding Franklin Hayes, leaving nothing but raw truth and uncomfortable silence. The mourners, once poised in quiet reverence, now sat stiffly, faces contorted with disbelief, shame, or stubborn denial. But Clara wasn't done. There was more to uncover, truths uglier than anyone had dared imagine. You think it ended there? Clara's voice broke the silence like glass shattering on tile. You think losing homes and lives was the final price we paid? No. Franklin's betrayal ran deeper than that. She clenched her hands, the veins along her arms taut with years of suppressed fury. Because the day Franklin stopped fighting wasn't the day he lost his way. It was the day he chose to stand on the other side of the line, the side holding the whip. The year was 1983, and Riverton was buzzing with excitement over a new development project. The Riverton Heights Initiative promised modern housing, vibrant shopping districts, and economic revitalization. Billboards plastered across the city showcased smiling white families strolling pristine sidewalks, children licking ice cream cones in front of shiny storefronts. But the land they were building on, it wasn't empty. It was the heart of the black community. Homes passed down through generations, churches where families gathered every Sunday, small businesses barely holding on after years of systemic neglect. And Franklin Hayes wasn't just supporting the project, he was leading it. Clara had found out the hard way. One evening, as she walked home from her housekeeping shift, she noticed bright orange notices taped to the windows of the local grocery store and barber shop. Property condemned. Eviction notice, 30 days. The signatures at the bottom made her heart stop. One name stood out among the bureaucratic scribbles, Franklin D. Hayes, project coordinator. Disbelief turned to rage as Clara stormed into Franklin's office the next morning, bypassing the receptionist who barely glanced up from her magazine. She found him sitting behind a sleek mahogany desk, flipping through papers, as if he weren't orchestrating the destruction of everything they'd once fought for. Tell me this is a mistake, Clara demanded, slamming one of the eviction notices onto his desk. Franklin looked up, startled. Then, as recognition dawned, his face hardened into that carefully controlled mask she'd come to despise. Clara, he sighed, setting down his pen. You shouldn't be here. Clara ignored the warning. You're behind this? Tearing down our homes, our businesses, for what? Fancy boutiques and overpriced condos. Franklin stood, smoothing his tie like a man preparing for battle. It's progress, Clara. The city's changing. We can't hold on to the past forever. The past. Clara's voice rose, disbelief cutting through her anger. That past is people's lives, their history, their survival. You're selling out your own community for a paycheck. Franklin's jaw tightened. It's more complicated than that. Is it? Clara snapped. Or is it just easier to climb higher when you're standing on our backs? Franklin circled his desk, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. Look around you, Clara. That neighborhood, it's falling apart. Crime's up, schools are underfunded, and the city council's been itching to redevelop for years. At least this way I can make sure the transition is smooth. Smooth? Clara laughed bitterly. You're bulldozing homes and calling it smooth? How much are they paying you to forget where you came from, Franklin? His face darkened. I didn't forget, I survived, and survival means making hard choices. Clara stepped closer, fury burning in her chest. No, survival means standing your ground, no matter how hard they push. But you? You didn't just step aside. You picked up the baton and swung it at your own people. Franklin's silence was deafening. Days later, the demolition began. Bulldozers rolled through the neighborhood at dawn, their engines drowning out the cries of families hauling belongings onto cracked sidewalks. Clara stood among them, arms wrapped tightly around Yasmin, now a teenager, who watched in horror as her childhood home crumbled beneath steel jaws. When the dust settled, all that remained was rubble and broken promises. But the final blow hadn't landed yet. Weeks after the demolition, Clara received a letter. Not an eviction notice, not another bureaucratic slap in the face, but something colder, crueler. It was from Franklin's office, stamped with the Riverton Heights Development Corporation seal. Dear Ms. Reynolds, it has come to our attention that you have been actively organizing resistance against the Riverton Heights project, including unauthorized protests and public disturbances. This behavior is in direct violation of city ordinances regarding redevelopment zones. As such, you are hereby prohibited from participating in any further activities that may disrupt ongoing progress. Failure to comply may result in legal action and permanent barring from Riverton Heights property. Respectfully, Franklin D. Hayes. Clara's hands shook as she read the signature, bold and unrepentant. Franklin hadn't just betrayed the movement, they had fought side by side. He had criminalized her resistance, wielding the very system they once defied as a weapon against her. The next time Clara saw Franklin, it wasn't in an office or on a street corner. It was on the news. He stood beside Howard Klein, the man who had first lured him away from the movement, smiling for the cameras as they cut the ribbon on the first completed Riverton Heights complex. This is a new dawn for Riverton, Franklin declared, flashing that same confident grin that once inspired hope. A step toward unity and prosperity for all. But Clara knew better. Unity for whom? Prosperity for whom? Certainly not for the families now scattered across the city, living in cramped apartments and shelters. Certainly not for James, her paralyzed nephew, who had been promised an accessible unit only to be denied once the project shifted focus to higher-income residents. And certainly not for Marcus, who'd been arrested again, this time for trespassing when he tried to visit the empty lot where his childhood home once stood. Clara stood before the casket now, eyes burning as she stared down at Franklin's lifeless face. He didn't just abandon us, she said, voice trembling with the weight of betrayal. He became the very thing we fought against, and when we cried for help, he silenced us. The mourners shifted uncomfortably. Margaret Hayes, Franklin's widow, dabbed at her eyes. Whether from grief or embarrassment, Clara couldn't tell. Michael Hayes sat rigid, his lips pressed into a thin line. But Howard Klein, he smiled, just a flicker, barely there, but enough for Clara to see the victory he still believed he held. Clara stepped away from the casket, her gaze sweeping the room. You call him a hero? A leader? No. Franklin Hayes wasn't a martyr. He was a man who traded righteousness for comfort and called it wisdom. And the blood spilled because of his choices. It's still wet on these streets. Silence followed her words, heavy and unyielding. No one moved, no one dared. Because deep down, they all knew the truth. Franklin's success had been built on sacrifice, but not his own. It was the sacrifice of those he left behind, those he deemed expendable in his climb to power. And the question that lingered, unspoken but undeniable, was this: When survival demands betrayal, can redemption ever truly follow? The church sat in stunned silence. The mourners, once wrapped in the comforting lie of Franklin Hayes' legacy, now squirmed under the weight of Clara's truth. The man they had eulogized as a community pillar was nothing more than a man who'd traded conviction for comfort, righteousness for power. And Clara? She was the last witness to the cost of his betrayal. Clara stepped forward, voice steady despite the storm brewing within her. You've heard what Franklin did to us, to his own people. But there's one thing you haven't heard, something he kept hidden even from those closest to him. Her gaze swept the room, landing on Michael Hayes, Franklin's son. His face was a mask of controlled fury, fists clenched at his sides. Clara met his glare without flinching. Franklin didn't die at peace, she continued, because peace doesn't come to a man drowning in regret. The memory was still fresh, seared into her mind like a scar that refused to fade. It had been just 2 months before Franklin's death. Clara hadn't spoken to him in years, not since the Riverton Heights project shattered what little faith she had left in him. But the phone call had come late one evening, unexpected and unwelcome. Clara, Franklin's voice rasped through the receiver, weaker than she'd ever heard it. I need to see you. Her first instinct had been to hang up, let him stew in the mess he'd made. But something in his tone, desperation, maybe even fear, stopped her. Against her better judgment, Clara agreed. They met in Franklin's home office, a lavish room lined with leather-bound books and framed accolades. He sat behind his desk, thinner than she remembered, skin pale and stretched taut over prominent cheekbones. His once confident posture sagged, like a man carrying a burden too heavy to bear. I don't have much time, he admitted, gesturing toward the pill bottles cluttering his desk. Doctors say it's my heart. Years of stress, guilt. Clara folded her arms, unmoved. What do you want, Franklin? Forgiveness? He chuckled bitterly, shaking his head. Forgiveness won't change what I've done, but maybe I can make it right. Franklin slid a folder across the desk. Inside were legal documents, trust agreements, property deeds, and bank transfers. At the top, in bold letters, Riverton Renewal Trust Fund. I set up a trust, Franklin explained, voice trembling, for the families we displaced, scholarships, housing assistance, legal aid, everything I should have fought for when I had the chance. Clara's eyes narrowed. Why now? Why not when it mattered? Franklin looked away, shame carved into every line of his face. Because I was a coward. I chose survival over justice, and I hated myself for it every day. Silence hung between them, thick with decades of betrayal and broken promises. Finally, Franklin spoke again, barely above a whisper. I need you to oversee it, Clara. Make sure the money goes where it's supposed to. Make sure Howard Klein and his people can't touch it. Clara stiffened at the mention of Howard Klein, Franklin's longtime business partner, the man who had first lured him away from the movement. Klein was still powerful, still dangerous, and still watching over Riverton like a vulture circling its prey. You really think Klein's gonna let this slide? Clara asked, voice sharp. You built his empire, Franklin. He won't let you tear it down, not even from the grave. Franklin nodded slowly. That's why I didn't put my name on it. The trust is in yours. You'll have full control once I'm gone. Clara blinked, stunned. You expect me to clean up your mess after everything? No, Franklin murmured. I expect you to protect our people, like I should have. For the first time in decades, Clara saw a flicker of the man she once believed in, the young idealist who stood beside her on the courthouse steps, defying the odds. But that man was long gone, buried beneath years of compromise and cowardice. Still, the papers didn't lie. The trust was real, and it was substantial, millions set aside for housing, education, and legal support for Riverton's displaced families. Clara sighed, pushing the folder back across the desk. Oh, you think throwing money at the problem fixes what you broke? Franklin's eyes, dull and sunken, met hers. No, but it's all I have left. She should have walked away, left him to drown in his regret. But the names of those he'd hurt, Marcus, James, Yasmin, echoed in her mind. This trust wouldn't undo the damage, but it might stop the bleeding. Reluctantly, she picked up the folder. If Klein finds out, he'll come after me. Franklin's lips curled into a humorless smile. Let him. I won't be around for him to punish. 2 weeks later, Franklin was dead. Heart failure, they said, peaceful in his sleep. But Clara knew better. There was nothing peaceful about dying with the weight of betrayal on your soul. Now, standing beside his casket, Clara pulled a folded document from her purse, the trust agreement, notarized, and ironclad. This, she said, holding it up for all to see, is Franklin Hayes' final act, not charity, not redemption, responsibility. For every family he displaced, every life he broke, every promise he shattered. The crowd stirred, murmurs rising like restless waves. Michael Hayes, still seated at the front, sprang to his feet, face flushed. With anger, "This is outrageous," he barked. "My father never mentioned any trust. This woman's trying to steal from his estate." Clara's eyes narrowed. "Steal? Your father gave up everything to make sure this money went to the people he betrayed. And you want to fight it? Go ahead, but you'll be fighting his signature, his lawyers, and the truth." She slapped the folder onto the casket, the sound echoing through the silent church. Franklin Hayes may have died a coward, but at least he tried to leave something behind besides broken promises. Michael's mouth opened, then closed, fury battling disbelief. Around the room, expressions shifted, from doubt to understanding, from anger to reluctant acceptance. Clara turned to the mourners, her voice sharp and unwavering. "You praised him for his charity while ignoring the cost. Well, here's the cost, and here's the chance to pay it forward." Comment number 1, if you believe Franklin's final act was redemption, like if you think it was too little, too late. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. But the real question is, when powerful men fall, who rises to take their place? Stay tuned, because Clara's fight was far from over. The church stood frozen in the aftermath of Clara's revelation. The trust documents lay atop Franklin's casket like a final indictment, exposing the man behind the myth. Faces once filled with sorrow, now twisted with disbelief, shame, and simmering anger. But the storm brewing within the room was nothing compared to what came next. A sharp clap of footsteps echoed from the back. Howard Klein, Franklin's longtime business partner and the architect of Riverton's gentrification, rose from his seat, his expression cold and calculating. He adjusted his suit jacket with the practiced ease of a man used to power and control. "This," Klein drawled, stepping forward, "is a farce, an outright fabrication." Clara's eyes narrowed as Klein approached, the corners of his mouth curling into a predatory smile. "Franklin was a smart man," Klein continued, his gaze sweeping the room like a hawk circling prey. "But he wasn't foolish enough to hand control of his assets to a woman who spent her life fighting progress." Progress. That word again. Clara clenched her fists, nails biting into her palms. "Progress," she snapped. "You mean displacement, destruction, lives shattered while you lined your pockets." Klein waved off her words like an annoying fly. "Call it what you want, Ms. Reynolds, but the law doesn't care about sentiment. Those documents you're flaunting?" He nodded toward the trust agreement. "Fraudulent. I've already spoken with Franklin's legal counsel. There's no record of this trust in the official estate filings." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, doubt creeping back into their eyes. Michael Hayes, Franklin's son, stepped forward, emboldened by Klein's certainty. "She's lying," Michael spat, face flushed with fury. "Trying to steal from my father's estate." Clara stood her ground. "I don't need a dime of Franklin's money. This trust wasn't for me. It was for the families your father destroyed while you sat comfortably in your damn ivory tower." But the tide was turning. Fear and confusion spread like wildfire. People who had moments ago nodded in reluctant agreement now exchanged uneasy glances. Klein's influence, like poison in the bloodstream, worked quickly. Before Clara could speak, again the heavy thud of footsteps filled the room. 2 uniformed police officers strode down the aisle, hands resting on their holsters. The taller one, Officer Grant, was all too familiar. He'd been the same cop who arrested Marcus years ago during the first wave of evictions. "Ms. Reynolds," Officer Grant announced, voice cold and authoritative, "we need you to come with us." There's been a complaint filed for attempted fraud and theft of estate assets. The church gasped as the officers moved toward Clara. She stood rooted to the spot, disbelief flashing across her face. Fraud? Theft? Her voice rose, shaking with rage. This is Klein's doing. He's trying to bury the truth along with Franklin. Klein smirked, hands casually slipping into his pockets. I warned Franklin about trusting the wrong people. Guess he should have listened. The officers didn't wait for explanations. One grabbed Clara's arm, twisting it behind her back as the other snapped handcuffs around her wrists. The cold metal bit into her skin, a brutal reminder of how quickly power could turn truth into crime. Don't fight it, ma'am, Officer Grant muttered, steering her toward the exit. You'll only make it worse. The crowd, moments ago, hanging on Clara's every word, now watched in stunned silence. Some turned away, unwilling to meet her eyes. Others whispered, their loyalty shifting like sand beneath uncertain feet. Even Margaret Hayes, Franklin's widow, sat frozen, her face pale and expressionless. But not everyone stood idly by. Yasmin, Clara's granddaughter, had slipped quietly to the back of the church when Klein first stood. Now, phone in hand, she pressed record, the camera lens trained on the unfolding injustice. Grandma. Yasmin's voice cut through, the noise sharp and defiant. Don't say a word, I've got everything. Klein's head snapped around, eyes narrowing. Put that phone away, girl. You're interfering with official police business. Yasmin didn't flinch. Interfering? Like you interfered when you blackmailed Franklin into selling out his people. Like you're interfering now to bury the truth. She took a step forward, raising the phone higher. The screen glowed brightly, broadcasting the scene live to hundreds and rapidly climbing viewers. Comments flooded the feed, outrage spilling. From the digital world into reality. This is disgusting. Protect Clara, she's fighting for justice. How is this still happening in 2024? Clara, eyes locked on Yasmin, felt a flicker of hope pierce through the suffocating dread. You don't scare us, Klein, she said quietly, voice steady despite the handcuffs biting into her wrists. You never did. Klein's face twisted into a snarl. Get her out of here, he barked at the officers, and confiscate that damn phone. But it was too late. Yasmin, quick as lightning, darted toward the church doors, phone still streaming. Try and catch me, she taunted, disappearing into the sunlight. The officers hesitated, unsure whether to pursue the teenager or finish hauling Clara out the side entrance. That moment of indecision was all Clara needed. Listen to me, Clara shouted, twisting to face the crowd despite the officer's grip tightening on her arm. This is what power does. It silences truth. It buries justice. And if you let them walk out of here thinking they've won, Franklin's betrayal won't end with his death. It'll live on through every one of you who chooses silence. The words hit like a slap. Some mourners looked away, shame burning their cheeks. Others, younger faces in the back, pulled out their own phones, cameras blinking to life. Klein, realizing he was losing control of the narrative, stepped forward, fury etched into every line of his face. Enough! She's a criminal, she's always been a criminal. But the tide had turned again. Samuel Johnson, a local teacher who had quietly sat near the back, stood abruptly. You call her a criminal, Klein, for exposing the truth? I grew up in the neighborhood you bulldozed. My mother died in a shelter after you tore down our home. If Clara Reynolds is a criminal, then you're a damn warlord. Another voice rose. From the left, Mrs. Parker, the elderly woman who had run the community daycare until Riverton Heights forced her out, leaned heavily on her cane as she stood. Franklin may have lost his way, but Clara didn't. And if she says this trust is real, I believe her. More followed. One by one, people rose. Former neighbors, displaced families, forgotten victims of Riverton's progress. Their voices, fractured for years, finally found harmony. The officers faltered, unsure whether to proceed. Klein, red-faced and livid, whirled on them. What are you waiting for? Arrest her! But Officer Grant hesitated, radio crackling faintly at his side. He glanced at the crowd, then at Yasmin's live feed still broadcasting from somewhere outside. Millions were watching now, millions seeing the truth Klein had tried so hard to bury. With a grunt of frustration, the officer released Clara's arm. I think we've done enough damage for one day. Clara stumbled forward, free once more, as the crowd parted around her like the Red Sea. She locked eyes with Klein, whose smug confidence had curdled into panic. "This isn't over," Klein hissed, voice low and venomous. "You can't win against people like me." Clara, breathless but unbowed, straightened her spine. "Maybe not alone, but look around, Klein. I'm not alone anymore." And for the first time in decades, she believed it. The truth, once buried under wealth and power, had clawed its way to the surface. And it wasn't going back underground. Not this time. Not ever. The church doors swung shut behind the officers, leaving behind an uneasy hush. Clara stood in the center aisle, wrists red and raw from the handcuffs, but her spirit unbroken. Klein had underestimated her. He had underestimated the community, too. And now the truth he'd worked so hard to bury was unraveling in real time. Yasmin burst back into the room, phone still clutched in her hand, face flushed with adrenaline. "It's everywhere, Grandma," she panted, waving the device. "Your arrest, Klein's threats. People are sharing it, news stations are picking it up. They're calling it the Riverton betrayal." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She glanced around the room, seeing the faces of those who had once been silent, now standing tall. Samuel Johnson, Mrs. Parker, Marcus, people Franklin's ambition had crushed, but whose resilience had never truly died. But Klein wasn't finished. He stormed toward Clara, face contorted with fury. "You think a few videos and some bleeding heart sympathy will undo decades of work? I own this town, Clara. The council, the police, the courts. That trust? It's dead the moment I say it." As Clara stood her ground, voice steady despite the fire raging in her chest. "You owned this town because you kept us divided. But look around, Howard. Your empire's cracking, and this time, you won't patch it up with lies and intimidation." Suddenly, the heavy oak doors creaked open again. A tall figure strode in, Attorney Rachel Martinez, a prominent civil rights lawyer from Montgomery, her tailored suit immaculate despite the chaos unfolding around her. Beside her, Detective Caleb Reed, a black officer long known for challenging corruption within the force, adjusted his badge with quiet authority. "Ms. Reynolds," Rachel nodded, voice sharp and professional. "I've reviewed the trust documents. They're legitimate. Franklin Hayes may have been many things, but he was meticulous when it came to paperwork. The trust is ironclad, and as executor you have full legal authority." Klein's face drained of color. "This is ridiculous. I'll have my lawyers—" Rachel cut him off with a cold smile. "Oh, they'll be busy, because Detective Reed here has something for you." Reed stepped forward, holding a thick envelope. "Howard Klein," he announced, voice echoing through the church. "You're under investigation for conspiracy to commit fraud, intimidation of a legal trustee, and illegal displacement of protected residents under the Fair Housing Act." The room erupted. Klein stumbled back, eyes darting toward the exits, but Reed blocked his path. "You thought you could bury the truth forever," Reed muttered, snapping handcuffs around Klein's wrists. "But you forgot one thing. People fight back when they've got nothing left to lose." As the officers led Klein away, his protests fading into the distance, Clara exhaled shakily. It was over. Decades of betrayal, heartbreak, and loss finally laid bare for the world to see. But the victory tasted bittersweet. Michael Hayes, Franklin's son, stood rigid near the casket, fists trembling at his sides. His world had crumbled. Not just the image of his father, but the inheritance he'd expected to secure his future. He locked eyes with Clara, bitterness etched into every line of his face. "This doesn't change what you did to him," Michael hissed. "You destroyed my father's legacy." Clara's gaze softened, but her voice held firm. "Your father destroyed his own legacy long before I spoke a word. He chose power over people, and in the end it broke him. But at least he tried to make it right. Can you say the same?" Michael faltered, anger draining into something closer to grief. Without another word, he turned and walked away, shoulders hunched under the weight of disillusionment. The church emptied slowly after that. Mourners whispered among themselves, some shaken, others thoughtful. But a few, Samuel, Mrs. Parker, Yasmin, lingered, their presence a testament to resilience born from hardship. Yasmin approached Clara, sliding her phone into her pocket. "The news is already calling you a hero," she said quietly. People are talking about the trust, about how it's going to rebuild the community. Scholarships, housing, legal aid, it's really happening. Clara nodded, exhaustion settling into her bones. It's a start, but money doesn't fix everything, baby. Trust funds can't bring back the homes we lost, the lives shattered. It can't make James walk again or erase the years Marcus spent behind bars for nothing. Yasmin's eyes glistened, but she stood tall. No, but it gives us something. We haven't had in a long time, hope, and this time we're not letting it slip away. Outside, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the worn steps of the church. As Clara stepped out into the cool evening air, she paused, looking back at the building where so much truth had finally come to light. Franklin Hayes had died a complicated man, neither hero nor villain, but something far more human. His final act, born from guilt and regret, had sparked a movement he could never have led while alive. Redemption hadn't saved him, but it had empowered those he'd once abandoned. Clara reached into her purse, pulling out the folded trust document, now worn from the day's chaos. She held it tightly, the weight of responsibility pressing down but no longer unbearable. "This isn't the end," she murmured to herself, voice lost in the evening breeze. "It's just the beginning," with Yasmin by her side and the community. Rallying behind her, Clara stepped off the church steps and into the streets of Riverton. No longer broken, no longer silent, but ready to build something stronger together. And this time, no one would tear it down. The story of Franklin Hayes and Clara Reynolds is more than just a tale of betrayal and redemption. It's a stark reminder of the price paid when silence replaces courage. Franklin's journey from civil rights activist to corporate figurehead shows how easily power can corrupt even the most well-intentioned souls. He didn't wake up one day deciding to abandon his community. It happened slowly, choice by choice, as he prioritized survival and success over principle. But survival without integrity is hollow. Franklin learned that too late. His final attempt to right his wrongs, establishing the trust fund, wasn't redemption, it was reparation. A chance not to erase the past, but to ensure the future looked different for those he'd once fought, beside and later betrayed. Clara's resilience is the true heart of this story. She could have walked away, consumed by bitterness. Instead, she stood her ground, not just for herself, but for generations silenced by systemic injustice. She proved that one voice, when joined by others, can topple even the most fortified walls of corruption. But here's the real lesson. Change doesn't come from money, power, or fleeting apologies. It comes from standing up when it's hardest, speaking out when silence feels safer, and refusing to let fear dictate the future. It's about community, about people like Clara, Yasmin, Samuel, and countless others who turned shared pain into collective power. Now the question falls to you. If you were in Clara's shoes, would you have fought, even when the odds were stacked against you? Comment number 1. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for remembering that silence never protects the oppressed. It only shields the oppressor. Stay safe, stay strong, and never stop fighting for what's right. See you in the next story.